Thank you, Eric. And hello, everybody. Welcome to our session today. Thanks so much for joining us, so many of you for joining us. And a special hello today to our colleagues in Puerto Rico, hence my backdrop. We wish we were on our way to Puerto Rico to convene. We can't do that this year, but we're sending you all our best. We all know that the arts field has seen success in advocating for public support of the arts, right? Over the course of time, we have largely maintained public support at the local, state, and federal levels. And for the most part, we have grown that support modestly and incrementally. For more than 50 years, we have also defended public support of the arts. And of course, that defensive posture is never easy. But the question remains, have we adequately shifted support from a frame of nicety and good to support to a frame of necessity and critical to support? There's no spoiler alert here. We know that we're not where we want to be. We also know that for the arts to strengthen our nation in all the ways the arts are uniquely positioned to do so, a more significant and appropriate level of support is needed. As much as we are committed to public investments in the arts as a nonpartisan issue, some treat it as partisan, and that certainly impedes our greater success. We know the arts are not and should not be a partisan issue. We also know we enjoy support from our champions on both sides of the aisle, but with deeper, more committed support across the full political spectrum, we could surely set the stage for game-changing investments. At NASAA, we see the opportunity to create shifts in art support that are bigger than just influencing the next Congress. Building deeper political will for public investments in the arts across the entire political spectrum will be essential to secure any kind of significantly greater and sustainable support. Building this level of support will require serious intentionality, right? We've got to appeal to more conservatives as well as additional moderates and progressives while we maintain the support of our current champions. And NASAA is actively working to accomplish this. Our journey has included commissioning a national GOP opinion poll related to arts value and support. The poll helped us begin to learn more about a part of the electorate we need to understand better. We also convened a bipartisan think tank to help us explore shifting our strategies. We learned from those efforts and others, and we improved our advocacy strategies as a result. And so continuing this journey, we've engaged in the research and development of new messaging strategies to help us garner deeper support more fully across the political spectrum. And I'm pleased we can start sharing that work with you today. Our goal is really a simple one. We want to motivate deeper and more meaningful public funding for arts and creativity. As you hear about the new message frame, you'll hear some familiar themes and you'll hear some new ones. Today, the good folks at Metropolitan Group will present the new work to you. A little later this fall, we'll publish a narrative guide designed to help you make great and effective use of the new message framework you'll hear about today. We're currently refining that message framework, so I couldn't be happier about presenting this work to you today, because hearing your questions and your observations inside the chat and otherwise will help us refine the messaging framework, and then by extension, refine the guide that we'll be providing for everyone. Big picture, we believe effective use of the new message frames will help us attract new advocates and build the capacity of all arts advocates to communicate more compellingly and effectively across the entire political spectrum. We also believe the effective use of this new tool can help us drive the political expectation for arts and creativity as necessary investments for America. And with that, I'm pleased to hand the virtual mic over to Rob Sasser of the Metropolitan Group to get us rolling. Rob?
Thank you, Pam, so much. And as I scan the participant list, it's just such a joy to see so many old friends from our Creating Connection days. It's also a joy to see some of the collaborators that we've had the chance to engage with, both at NASAA's 2018 Policy Think Tank, as well as through the interview process and various steps along the path that Pam just outlined. So great to see so many familiar faces and so many fresh ones too. My colleague Eric Giles is going to be popping into the chat the link to the slide deck that we will be presenting today. We do recommend that you go ahead and download that deck so that when we get to the 2 question and answer sessions, you have access to the information that we will have shared and can go back in time a little bit and refamiliarize yourself with that content to help engage in the conversation. I also wanted to introduce my 2 colleagues, Eric Friedenwald-Fishman, who will be co-facilitating this conversation with me, as well as my colleague Tovar Cerulli, who will be facilitating the conversation in the chat. Because we only have two moments during our conversation today that are really focused on a conversation as a large group, we do encourage you, if you have questions along the way, especially if it's a clarifying question, to populate that into the chat live in the moment. If it's an easy question that Tovar can answer, he will go ahead and just do so in the moment in the chat. Some of those he will be flagging as important topics of conversation once we get into the larger question and answer. And if toggling between a chat feature and a large group discussion and focusing on our conversation isn't right for you, that's fine. The chat is there for you to have access to it if that plays to how you best engage in these kinds of conversations. Otherwise, we can just direct you there when it's time to do so during the question and answers. With that, I'm going to orient you to how we will be focusing our conversation today. So we do have 90 minutes together, and we are going to focus as much of that time as we can, roughly about 50 minutes, on sharing out the messaging that is the result of this work, and 25 or so minutes on a conversation with you about what elements of that messaging resonate and where there are examples from your communities that help to illuminate the kinds of messaging that we'll be sharing with you today. To set context for that conversation, we will share out some of the high-level findings from the research that guided that work. First, let me just orient you to the research that Pam had alluded to in her introduction. So she guided this.
So maybe we could talk about you opening. I need an opener.
Eric, I trust that you can mute all participants besides me. Thank you. So as Pam mentioned, there was a robust research phase that informed the first draft of the message framework that we tested. And that began with a literature scan of the existing research. That included a real focus on research about conservative values. That included the work of analysts like Haidt and Lakoff. We also obviously looked at the 2017 GOP registered voter survey that NASAA led, as well as reports by independent think tanks like Pew, and a number of articles and essays that were written to both argue for and to argue against public funding for arts and creativity, among many other sources. We also wanted to be guided by research and learnings and insights from beyond the arts and culture realm. So we looked to other fields that have successfully broadened the base of political support, as well as having significantly increased public funding for their causes. And the issue areas that we looked at were clean energy, land and water conservation fund, and the National Science Foundation. In each of those, we interviewed congressional staff, industry leaders, and advocates to understand how they were able to affect the kinds of shifts that they were able to do. To give you just a little bit of context, in case some of these fields are new to you, the Land and Water Conservation Fund is a broad concept that initially had sort of a broad base of support, but then had some vehement partisan opposition over the past decade But despite that, just in this past few months, they were able to permanently and fully fund the fund to the tune of $900 million. With the National Science Foundation, there has been some partisan opposition to the social sciences specifically, and efforts that were designed to limit the mandate of the NSF. And despite those efforts, the NSF has successfully positioned itself to receive bipartisan support. And in the past 3 decades, it has increased its funding fourfold, now totaling $8.3 billion in 2020. So these are the kinds of fields that we wanted to look to in order to understand how did they make those pivots and how do they work against those headwinds and where are their implications for the arts and creativity field. As a result of this formative research, we developed a draft message framework, and it was that message framework that we then took into the testing process. The testing included interviews with 27 elected officials and their influencers and advocates across the arts and culture space. Because we were really focused in our research on what are the ideas that will resonate with conservative policymakers while maintaining the support of progressive champions, you'll see that we oversampled among Republican members of Congress as compared with Democratic members. The Republicans also include one mayor who is the mayor of a city that successfully increased taxes specifically to build out creative infrastructure. Our sample included 10 arts advocates, including probably some of you today, 2 appropriation staffers, 1 on the Senate side and 1 on the House side, the chair of the National Endowment for the Arts, as well as 1 lobbyist with expertise in this space. We were also advised along the way by an advisory group that the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies recruited specifically to bring some really diverse perspectives, not only from within its network, but also across some of its really key partners to help ensure that this is a message framework that will not only work within NASAA's network, but will also be augmentative to the advocacy that's happening across the field. So before we get into findings, we want to create a little bit of space to make sure that we all understand the terminology that we'll be using so much today. So my colleague, Eric Fishman, is going to share with you some context about what we mean when we use terms like narrative, framing, and messaging. Eric?
Hi, everybody. As Rob said, it's fantastic to at least see on Zoom so many colleagues from so many aspects of work we've done together over the years, and I'm really sad not to be joining you in San Juan, and hope that we'll be able to all visit each other in person soon. I wanted to just give a quick context because there's so many of these sessions where one person's saying narrative and another person's saying message, and you get into a construct of what is it we're actually talking about. So I want to cover a little bit of the distinctions between narrative, stories, messaging, framing, and also the receptivity and resilience of those that we are communicating with. I'm not sure if you can actually hear me because Zoom has frozen on my end. So I'm hoping you can hear me as I'm talking, but I cannot see.
We can hear you, Eric. We got you.
Excellent. Thank you. I appreciate it because everything is frozen on my end. So narrative in the construct that we're discussing today is the big picture way in which people see.
Eric, I need to unmute you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, everything on Zoom froze for a moment, the screen disappeared, now I'm back. So rewinding, when we talk about narrative, narrative is the overarching way that we see an issue or an idea or a part of our life. And in this instance, the illustration, the narrative is the whole tree. The narrative is that which we view and is the construct in which we take in information. And the way that we experience narrative as human beings is primarily through stories. And those of us that work in the arts and creative space are often in the business of telling stories. But stories can be very formalized stories. Stories are what we see in the media. Stories are what we hear reinforced in our family, in our workplace. And the stories are the leaves on the tree. There are the hundreds and hundreds of stories we hear that reinforce, because we have a way of seeing, reinforce that way of seeing. Messaging, and most of our time today is going to be talking about messaging, are the ways of articulating a narrative frame, a way of getting people to understand and to connect in and to have the way they see being the narrative that we desire. And then the framing, which we're going to spend a little bit of time on today, the framing is really the architecture that underlies that messaging. What are the core values that people have that they, if triggered and if connected in that messaging, will motivate them to shift how they view an issue and to be more supportive of it or less supportive of it, to elevate its importance? How are they defining the problem? How are they seeing the solution? And who are they seeing as having responsibility either for the reason it's a problem or for making it a solution? And often when folks are talking about narrative and messaging, they just talk about putting the information out. And it's really important that we pay attention to who's receiving that information, because the stakeholders, the people that see that tree, that see that narrative, that experience the stories, that experience the messaging and are also helping tell it, they bring to this their own lived experience. And within that lived experience, their value sets, their perspectives. They bring to it the environment in which they are operating. Where are they in terms of their economics? Where are they in terms of their sense of resiliency? And they also bring to it their echo chambers. Who is it that they listen to? What media do they watch? Who contributes to their campaigns? What do they see in their community? What do they experience in terms of the arts? They have their own set of echo chambers. And that receptivity and resilience means how receptive will they be to a message frame once they've accepted a message frame and start seeing the world in a narrative that in this instance has arts and culture as a necessity as opposed to a nicety. How resilient is that way of seeing when other messages come their way? So that's the core concept that we're talking about here. And we're going to make this tangible as we go through in terms of arts and culture. Very quickly, as Rob said, we looked at some other movements, and just in the last few years, a very, very proactive effort has been made among the clean energy space to radically shift the narrative in terms of how is clean energy seen, and to change the stories and messages that advance that narrative. And it's had quite an impact. Over 120 cities, the majority of which have either Republican mayors or Republican majority city councils, have passed 100% clean energy standards. And that meta narrative, the way of seeing that they moved to, was this idea that we're ready for 100% clean energy. And that readiness being not only a technological readiness, but a readiness in terms of the need that society has. And the stories they've told are about the economic impacts for rural communities, the huge increase of jobs and how those jobs actually pay more, the independence of communities and of people's own ability to generate some of their power, and the problem set stories around how many kids and how disparate and non-equitable the kids who suffer from asthma, who suffer from chronic disease needs that are related to dirty power. And their messaging really focused on healthy kids and families, healthy local economies, greater independence, and a technology that's completely ready, but politics are getting in the way. You'll notice in all of that, I didn't say a word about climate change, because the previous narrative that clean energy had been pushed through because of the stories and the messaging that a huge advocacy community had worked on for over a decade was that to fight climate change, we must have clean energy. And what we found was that framing and that set of messaging and that set of stories added up to a narrative, which is clean energy is something we need if we're going to fight climate change. And the majority of American voters were not motivated by that. And a whole set of policymakers pull away from that. And shifting the core narrative and the way of seeing the issue has led to an opening of who's willing to support that change and what the level of expectation is in it. Back to you, Rob.
Thank you, Eric. We will now hit the high points in terms of our research findings that informed the message framework for this work. The first of those is that when conservative policymakers make the case for arts and creativity, the reasons always come back to this idea of strength. whether that's in the context of building the community fabric that encourages people to stay in that community and raise their family there, helping returning veterans to overcome traumatic brain injury or post-traumatic stress disorder, helping stem the tide of the opioids addiction crisis in our nation, or even the much more familiar argument to all of us, which is the ways that arts and creativity help bolster the economic strength and economic success of our nation, as well as of our communities across the land. The types of arguments that we hear keep coming back to this idea that arts and creativity help to strengthen us as families, communities, states, and as a nation. And this framing was also validated in our research of the other fields. It's also worth noting that on this front, our formative research uncovered that this also presents an opportunity for shifting the paradigm in terms of how arts and creativity advocacy is experienced, and to shift from positions of trying to hang on to the current budget, or to try and mitigate the extent of budget cutbacks, and rather to shift to a position of strength that is really focused on how do we significantly increase the funding for this field. It's also worth noting that in the context of the clean energy and science fields, we found that innovation and how those fields help to keep us competitive globally was really important in terms of how they made the case for dramatically increasing their funding. So specifically, they were looking at how other countries like China were really doubling down on their investments, whether it's in clean energy or in science broadly. And they were using that data to make the case for why we as a nation need to do the same, or run the risk of ultimately manufacturing the inventions that are created elsewhere. The next is that 4 guiding values that motivate public funding rose to the top in our research as those that are relevant in an arts and creativity context. Those are strength, innovation, prosperity, and community. And as Eric just explained, those values are what your constituencies stand for and are motivating them to take the kinds of action that you need them to take, and therefore need to be reinforced throughout your messaging. A stereotype that is worth busting for some, although probably not anybody on this call, is that is the notion that the political champions for arts and creativity are predominantly progressive. And NASAA's own research has helped to illuminate the fact that the adjustments in public funding for arts and creativity and for the NEA don't follow neat party lines in terms of when one party's in power, there's more funding, and when the other one's in power, there's less funding. It's actually much more varied than that. And our own research really validates what NASAA and others know to be true, which is that there are really political champions for arts and creativity across the spectrum. It includes people like Tea Party conservatives such as French Hill and Mike Huckabee, rank and file members of the Republican Party like Ken Calvert and Don Young and Glenn Thompson, to moderates like Murkowski and Capito. And they're obviously joined by a chorus of progressives that include the likes of Pingree, Bonamici, and McCollum. So when we think about who arts political advocates, political champions are, we need to be thinking about that in really broad constructs. It's also worth noting that when we listen to what those policymakers say when they talk about why they vote for public funding for arts and creativity, the ideas come back to very tangible benefits, and we'll start breaking down later on in our conversation today what those benefits are. So now I want to, those are just some of the highlights of our findings from that formative research phase, the literature scan, as well as the exploration of other sectors. As I mentioned, we developed a message framework that was inspired by that research and also inspired by the policy think tank that NASAA hosted back in 2018. We then went out and we conducted those interviews. I showed you the slide of the individuals that we interviewed to test that message framework. And this next set of findings are the findings related to the responses that we got to the message framework that we tested. And the first is that the message framework, broadly speaking, resonated really well across the political spectrum. And the reason I want to underscore that is because our research was really focused on how do we develop messages that will resonate really effectively on the conservative side of the aisle, while also resonating with progressives. So our hypothesis was that it was going to resonate with conservatives, but that was worth testing because in some cases this messaging was really new. But also worth validating the idea that the values and the messages that we were driving toward the message framework would work equally well with progressive colleagues as well. It's worth also noting that on the progressive side, while progressive elected officials would note that this message framework does work for them, there were people across the board, including on the appropriations level and sort of across the ecosystem, who were really expressing interest in getting access to this message framework once it was done, because they were seeing it as helping them to tee up conversations about the value of public funding for arts and creativity in new ways. And one of those new ways is this idea of strength, how arts and creativity strengthen our nation. In our testing, that was the very first statement that people read, and that was by design. The very first word on the page was strength. And that was experienced as new and additive to many of the people that we interviewed. Sometimes people would pause and they would say, well, you need to really build out the case for what that means, which is of course what we do in our messaging. But we would invite them at that time to say, well, how would you make the case for that? And they would fill in that blank with ideas that were actually reflected later on in the conversation in our benefits messages. So it was really helpful for us to see that that strength concept is experienced as new. However, it is believable and it resonates, and lawmakers are able to connect the dots on their own credibly between that concept and the benefits that will be core to this messaging. If you have grounding in the robust research that informed creating connection, as I know many of you do, you already know that prior research underscores the importance of expanding frames from capital A arts and capital C culture to broader definitions of our field that help to invite more people in and for them to see the array of activities and benefits that are accrued through the work of our field. We tested in our research whether this frame of arts and creativity would be experienced as a sort of broader definition and might help people to see the various ways that this helps to benefit our society, not just the museums in big cities, but also the music festivals in small towns that in some cases are the major attraction annually that help to drive the biggest traffic into their community and provide the biggest economic boom. So we did find in our research that this framing is more inviting for policymakers and their influencers. It's worth noting that for some, obviously this term creativity is going to be familiar to many of you from advocacy in the past of shifting from STEM to STEAM. And what we did learn in our research is that in the past, when the term creativity has been used, there are instances where we are making some assumptions about how they are making the leap between the idea of creativity and how that drives innovation, and then how that drives global competitiveness. And in this message framework, how those are all nested under this idea of strength. And what we learned in our research is that some policymakers need us to help them connect those dots because they are going from creativity to innovation on their own, and they need more handholding to understand what we mean in that context. As Pam said, the results of this work will be a narrative guide that we're developing now and that NASAA will be distributing later this fall. And one of the things that we're really focused on as a team now is how we can help provide a little bit of nuance that can help the field in this way. One of the messages that tested by far the most effectively in our research was this idea that the reason for public funding, not the reason that arts and creativity are a good idea, not the reason that arts and creativity benefit us, but the reason for public funding is that public investments are essential to ensure that the benefits of arts and creativity don't just occur in the communities where there's already a lot of wealth and where there can already be a lot of investment, but that they also accrue in every community nationwide, small and large, and including small and rural communities. And it's worth noting that that is an idea that works well, that is is a bell ringer regardless of whether you're a progressive policymaker or a conservative policymaker. It's a bell ringer regardless of whether you represent an urban area or rural communities. This idea that the reason for public funding is that it helps to stretch arts and culture to every community nationwide is really essential. And so you'll see when we get the narrative, the message framework, that we are lifting that up into a few different places. I've spoken to benefits several times, specifically that when we break down policymakers' statements, that they bucket into different things that we call tangible benefits. We tested a wide array of benefits, and the 5 that rose to the top in terms of motivating public funding are the ones that you see at the top of your screen. The first is economic success and global competitiveness. That was, by and large, the most motivating set of benefits for public funding. The next tier, the health and well-being, communities and education, are also very motivating for many policymakers, and it really varies depending on the individual policymaker, which would be in the first or second position. This is, one of the things that we were testing in our research is can we deliver a guide that's really simple for advocates to say, if you're talking to a Republican, you should frame it in this way, or a conservative, if you're talking to a progressive, you should frame it in this way. And our research shows that it's really very varied. You can have education be your main focus, if, whether you're on either side of the aisle. And as advocates, you already know that you just have to do your homework to understand what are their other policy priorities and how am I walking into the room to help frame this as helping them to achieve their hot button issues. The 5th benefit is beauty. And as one of the interviewees said, the beauty is the icing on the cake, but what policymakers want to fund is the cake. So economic success, health and well-being, communities and education, those are the core benefits that are going to motivate public funding. Beauty is a message that resonates for some as in the context of, while we're accomplishing these other benefits, arts and creativity also layer in these benefits for our community, that for some conservative policymakers, for example, include really helping us to find our God-given talents and to share them with others, or to bringing more grace into our lives and into our communities. So those can be very powerful statements. Sometimes policymakers have experienced those as being the lead benefit that advocates are walking into the room with. And the point that we really want to make here is that it can work for some. It probably sounds better coming from another policymaker than from an advocate. And it shouldn't be what you're leading with in terms of benefits, but rather is what you can layer in for the right policymaker as being an add-on in addition to these other benefits that it delivers. It is worth noting that obviously we were testing some of the boilerplate advocacy messages throughout our research as well. A couple that tested particularly well were the idea of public-private partnerships and how arts funding helps to drive those, as well as this the point that I know you're all already very familiar with, which is that for every public dollar invested, the arts field leverages that for an additional $9 in private funds. What's really important here is not just that those are good messages to continue using, but rather that they're very important, that policymakers experience them as making a case for how this is good governance. But what they also need to hear is the case for why public funding is essential. And sometimes what they haven't been getting in the conversations to date is that why public funding piece. So our recommendation is these are good talking points to continue including, but they need to be framed in the context of why public funding is so essential. And again, the key message there is about how arts and public funding ensures that arts and creativity benefit every community. Last but not least, you know that all policy is about context, and in this particular moment, what policymakers are really thinking about is how do we recover as a nation? How are we coming back stronger after after our recovery from COVID-19? And so when we were testing messages, the ideas and the questions that people were asking were often coming back to, well, what does this mean in terms of specific funding related to economic recovery? And when we get into the message framework here in a moment, you'll see that what we've crafted is something that's designed to be much more evergreen. So these are going to be core concepts that should be useful in any sort of socio-political construct, not just for this next election cycle, but for the next several. And what's going to be really important when you walk into the room is to contextualize your ask and to contextualize your messages in the moment in time and in the context of the policy priorities for that individual. So in the narrative guide, you will see some examples when we get into calls to action for some ways that you might think about having conversations that are specific to COVID-19. But there's a reason why you don't see that idea baked into the message framework that Eric is about to share, which again is meant to outlive this particular disaster or any others. So we have time for just a couple of questions. We are curious if there are any clarifying questions specific to the research, or if there's any observations or takeaways that you have. Since we only have time as a collective to dig into one or two, please do continue to populate the chat with your questions and reflections to share with the group. And Tovar, I'm wondering if there are any questions that have risen to the surface so far.
We have a couple questions that have come in so far. One is about the idea of public-private partnerships and it being sort of a broad concept, and so asking for a specific example or two of models of what those partnerships look like, what resonates with the folks that we interviewed. And then there's one other about sort of the COVID-19 context as well.
Okay. So as it relates, I'm going to start, but Eric, I'd be curious on your perspectives on the public-private partnerships. To be really clear, in terms of our testing, we were testing broad sets of ideas that are meant to set the messaging strategy. So we were not testing out whether a particular set of public-private partnerships are the ones that are most motivating versus another set. So we don't have data like that to share with you today. Eric, I don't know if there's any particular nuance from the conversations that you were a part of that are worth layering in.
The only one that I'll say is we heard from several lawmakers across the political spectrum and who are folks who support public funding for the arts, saying the idea of public-private partnerships is still resonant for policymakers. It's, people sometimes worry, is that passe? It's resonant, and they say, and the thing to hit on arts and culture is this field does public-private partnerships better than anybody. That the amount of leverage, the kind of impact you get really makes these partnerships private-public partnerships. It's public money that's sparking much bigger engagement of private money. So it's a real link from the public-private partnerships to that message around the 9-to-1 leverage. Again, to emphasize Rob's point, very, very important not to lead with that, because the other thing we heard over and over is people come in and that's what they talk about when they haven't first made the case of why should we do public funding at all. That makes the case of public funding is really well used and that the arts and culture field does better than most at leveraging that funding.
Thanks, Eric. Tovar, is there?
Yeah, so we have two more questions right now. The one on COVID-19, which I think is a fairly simple answer. The question is given the impact on the creative sector right now, and that theaters can't open, for example, and so on, are we recommending revised messaging about the link between arts and cultural events and economic vibrancy in downtowns and main streets? And the answer is yes. I mean, fundamentally, the broad messages about economy and economic strength and community strength and revitalization in a recovery context, particularly a COVID-19 recovery context, are very much about that link. Anything either of you want to layer onto that before we move to the other question?
No, but I did want to touch on the next question around this question of what about that we don't only own creativity.
Yes, that was the other question on the table. Yes, absolutely. Go ahead, Rob.
One thing that I would just note on the COVID front before we shift from there, one thing, so we weren't testing messaging around the real impact on the arts and creativity field of COVID-19. And yet there were so many policymakers who on their own really spoke to, what are we going to do? Given the fact that there are so many artists in this nation whose way of doing business involves convening people, which is the thing we can't do right now. So I'm sharing that with arts advocates so that you know that there is a receptive ear among many policymakers and you don't even have to necessarily make that case. There are people who are really feeling that as policymakers and really wrestling with what do we do about that.
So the other question that, thanks Rob, the other question that Eric wanted to speak to is a great one. How do you reconcile that creativity is in other domains? It's not owned by the arts, so it's in the sciences and elsewhere. Eric?
Great, yeah, so really excited to answer this one. Before I do, I want to share out one observation we heard from a couple of policymakers related to COVID-19, which was a musing on their part of if the arts and creativity community have been doing this kind of messaging for the 5 years leading up to now, would there have been more overt support built into the CARES Act as a part of the COVID response for arts and culture? That was not something we asked about. That was something that they were bringing up at the end of these meetings when we said, is there any other feedback you want to give us? So just want to touch on that. In terms of the not owning creativity, that's actually a huge strength. I'm sure many of you saw a couple of years ago Jamie Bennett speak where he said, how many people are golfers and everyone raises their hands, how many people are artists, no one does. The creating connection research that was very robust with the public and where this was more focused on policymakers found that the public, when you take that broader frame, they see it as both what I do in my garage being creative, building furniture, and what that amazing person does who went to Juilliard. And they don't have an issue of being able to own and see both. In this specific context, what we heard over and over again from policymakers was that creativity is this critical fuel for innovation in every field, in every profession, in the trades, regardless of where you are on the economic ladder, regardless of whether you're a farmer or a fine artist. And that what the arts and culture do, not just in arts education, but in terms of the experience people have in the community, is it exercises that creative muscle. And that's a part of why there's creativity in engineering and why there's creativity in architecture and why there's creativity in game design, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so we really don't need to own it as the arts. We actually need to get comfortable sharing that ownership, but we do need to unabashedly and with strength lay claim to a fundamental piece of what we do is we build that creative muscle in this country, and the creativity that people get from experiencing arts and culture as grown-ups, as kids, the experience people have in arts education, the experience they have with their own creative expression benefits every field and every endeavor in this country.
Thanks, Eric. So I'm going to suggest that for time, we move now into presentation of the message framework. If there are more questions about the findings, please feel free to continue populating those into the chat, and we can revisit those in the context of our messaging discussion a little bit later on. Eric, over to you.
Terrific. Okay, I think we need to jump to the next slide for the overview, and the next one. All right, so what we're going to be talking about today is what is the narrative, and the narrative is the shorthand for the big idea of the way we want people to see arts and creativity. We're going to talk about then the actual framework, which is a core message, which is the big idea distilled. It's the kind of core elevator pitch. What is the idea we need to connect people with? It's then a list of these key benefits that are the ones that were the most motivating and tangible to policymakers, a focused message on why public funding, and then a place to move into your call to action, which will be customized after today. Though if anybody does have an advocacy meeting coming up, the team at NASAA is ready to help you prepare for it even now. Want to remind folks before we go into this that what we're going to share and what will ultimately be in the message guide really is meant for two different purposes. Its primary use is as core source material. So as opposed to saying, go in and repeat these words verbatim, every conversation all of us have nationwide for the next 5 years with every policymaker, it's saying take this core framework, this core set of ideas, and tell these messages with the stories you tell. These messages are the trunk and the branches, but the way we're going to convey them most effectively is with the leaves, is with the stories that we're going to tell and the examples we give that are relevant to our community and to the ask that we are making. The second thing that these are is it does give us some tested language that when we need that fallback, when we need to say, okay, I've got to get a couple of key things into this email, I need to set up the script and train a couple of volunteers to go with me to make this, this presentation to a member of my legislature or to my member of Congress. This is language that has tested well and that we can use. So it's both language we can use, but it's not a straitjacket, it's a springboard. Okay, if we can move to the next slide. So Rob already said it, the overarching narrative is arts and creativity strengthen our nation. This is a really fundamental shift in frame. We want people to be able to see arts and creativity as not something that's a nice to have, but as a must have. And the idea that they strengthen our nation creates a space for us to see all of the strengthening that happens in the economics, all of the strengthening that happens in our lives as individuals, all the strengthening that happens for families and communities, and for the country as a whole. And this tests really, really well. It's the thing that fits down to the back of a business card. But this is the idea that over numerous campaigns and numerous efforts and lots of messaging, we want to move to a place that 5+ years from now, this is how most policymakers think of arts and creativity. So that's the narrative. Let's move to the key message. So our core message is arts and creativity make us stronger as individuals, families, communities, states, and as a country. They are a backbone of innovation, prosperity, and thriving people and places. Public funding for the arts and creativity is a high return investment that benefits every American in every city, town, and rural community nationwide. If we can go to the next slide, we're going to deconstruct this a bit because this is the core of what we're talking about. So this core message is packaging a bunch of key ideas together. We tested this as different components, and what we found is when we put them together, that is where policymakers really, really resonated. In our early testing, people were saying, you got to add this piece to it. But the first key is stronger. It's about the strength that we have in our economy as individuals, as families. And this does two things for us. It connects to the ultimate outcome and to the overarching narrative frame. But it also, something we heard from policymakers is, I like this posture of strength. It feels like you're not coming in and saying, gosh, would you please help us? Or, hey, we're not as important as other things. This lays claim in a way that shifts positioning. Next really important component of the core message, if we could go to the next slide, is this framing of arts and creativity. As Rob already said, and as somebody asked in a question, this framing of adding creativity opens the door to many more people and sends a cue to this idea of innovation and some of the impact that we see. Also very important to note that we really want to make sure we're not framing it as the arts, because that is perceived as being the elite special arts that are only for some people and only in some places. But when people hear arts and creativity, they see both the best symphony in the country, and they see their community music festival, and they see the innovation that takes place that creates an entrepreneur and a new company that creates jobs. If we can go to the next slide. The core message also triggers all of our key values. And those key values are what we found were the underlying values that motivate public funding for the arts. One of those is strength, which we've already hit as the make us stronger, but also it's really important that it's about communities, it's about innovation, and it's about prosperity. And if we can hit those ideas, that really resonates in terms of why we should be funding this endeavor. If we go to the next slide, you'll see the every American in every city, town, and rural community nationwide. This is the most powerful why public funding matters for arts and culture and why it's a good idea and worthy. And you'll notice what's very important here is it's both about every American. It's about the benefits going to people, and going to people who both are the folks who do art, the folks who are professionals, the folks who are in the audience, but also every other person that lives in that community, every person in the workplace where creativity sparked innovation and ideas. And it's also about every city, town, and rural community nationwide. We found that one of the things that's very compelling is policymakers, when they hear this, immediately go to, you know what? That's right. There's a lot of places that don't have big foundations. There's a lot of places that don't have big corporate headquarters. This is how we counter the argument of it should just be, I'm all for the arts, but it shouldn't be paid for with taxpayer money. So very important. If we can go to the next slide. And then, of course, we have this public-private partnership, the idea of a high return on the investment, this indicator that it's government done right and that it's money well spent. So these are the components in the core message. This core message is the distillation message. This, when folks say, what is it I need to have as my core boilerplate? This is that message. And then you can build it out by telling stories and giving examples that are relevant in your community. Once we've established the core message, as Rob shared in the research, we found what was very important was hitting tangible benefits that are delivered by arts and creativity. So if we could go to the next slide, I'm going to start talking about the benefits. In the message guide, the bulk of the guide will probably be the benefits because we are capturing data that backs up each of the benefits, examples of stories that make the benefits feel tangible and real. And what we're really encouraging is that every advocate think about, I'm going to talk about a benefit, what's the example of that benefit in this district, in this city, in this community? Is there a way that I can tell a story that gets this idea across? But the messaging on the benefits are first that arts and creativity are an American economic engine. They provide people with a foundation for creativity, equipping an innovative workforce, generating new ideas in every field, and keeping our nation globally competitive. Arts and creativity strengthen economic health by creating jobs in multiple industries, driving tourism, and providing opportunities for young people. There are many different ways to say each of these messages, but what I'm sharing with you is the core of each of these benefit messages. As Rob said, the order that you do them in is going to depend on the policymaker you're talking to. I'm going through the order that has economy at the top because it tested by far the strongest with all policymakers. The next three I'm going to share tested pretty evenly, and then we'll come to the final one, which is, as Rob said, the icing on the cake. Next is arts and creativity improve Americans' health and well-being. They're one of the most effective treatments for trauma, depression, and anxiety, including among our nation's veterans. Arts and creativity reduce our susceptibility to stress-related diseases, and art therapies help to forestall Alzheimer's and promote lifelong brain health while stemming the tide of the opioid crisis. People deeply believe that arts and culture are a critical factor of well-being, and they believe that it is one of the most effective ways to address some of the critical well-being issues in our nation. Moving on to the next benefit is about the benefit to communities. From rural towns to big cities, arts and creativity strengthen the fabric of America's communities. They celebrate local culture, both cherish traditions and exciting new ideas, telling stories of people and places. Arts and creativity promote connection and cohesion, foster the entrepreneurial spirit communities need to thrive, and create the kinds of communities where young people want to build families. Again, this idea of the value of communities and the strengthening of the fabric of communities, and you can see woven into this is a very important aspect about culture and tradition, but also about the change that's happening in communities, in the new ideas and the new people that are in communities. Moving on to the next benefit message is around education. Arts and creativity strengthen education. They set young people up for success, close the achievement gap, and improve test scores. Arts and creativity unleash human potential, promoting cognitive development and readiness to learn at every age. And they develop an innovative, globally competitive workforce by adding the key ingredient of creativity to STEAM education. Again, we can tell many stories about this. You can give examples in your local community. The idea of this being a driver of quality education and not a nice thing to add on to education is very resonant for policymakers. And then finally, beauty. And we heard from a number of advisors and from some advocates around, gosh, I'm not sure, I really want to make sure that we're getting at the intrinsic value of the arts. I'm not sure if that works for policymakers. And what we learned is that this is not motivating for most policymakers as a core benefit of what public dollars, of the reason to invest public dollars. It is for some. But what we found is virtually for all policymakers, after you've talked about economy and either well-being or education or community, depending on what you figured out as the best mix for that policymaker, saying, and on top of those benefits that are delivered, arts and creativity inspire us and bring grace and beauty into our lives. They give us opportunities to share our creative gifts and to experience the creativity of others. And that idea is resonant to policymakers as something they want in communities. Now, leading with this leads them to say, well, that's great, people should pay for that. But having this be an added benefit that you get on top of everything else is a value add that increases support. Let's now move to the why public funding message. We've already teed this up in a couple of places. But again, the key here is this idea of benefiting people everywhere. Public funding for arts and creativity is a high return investment in every town and rural community nationwide, not only in the biggest cities. It improves the lives of all Americans, equips an innovative workforce, and keeps us competitive globally. It's a great example of government done right that fuels public-private partnerships, leverages $9 in private funds for every public dollar invested, and puts tax dollars and decision-making authority into state and local hands. Really important in this message is we've tested a couple of different ways, and we've had some people say, ooh, what about that not only in the biggest cities? That feels like a bit of a negative. And what we found is when using this framing with the not only in the biggest cities, the response you get from policymakers is a lean in on, yeah, that's why we should have public funding. That's why it's important the government does this, because if you're lucky enough to live in one of the biggest cities, you have big foundations, you have big corporations, but we need to do this to make sure everybody benefits. So that framing is really important. Finally, the call to action. And the call to action will have to be customized for what it is that's going on in the context and what is the ask that you have. And in the message guide, we will put in some calls to action that NASAA is currently using, and that will adjust and change over time, and you'll adjust and change it for each ask that you're doing. But it's really a reinforcement of arts and creativity strength in our nation. We must increase our public investment in the many benefits they provide to people in Portland, Oregon, or in Detroit, or wherever it is that you're speaking, and the whole nation. And if we were out and advocating today, my guess is that we would have calls to action around we must include workforce and organizational support for arts and creativity in the next relief package that is a priority in the first 100 days. In a time of some of the greatest need for well-being, when all Americans have been through incredible trauma, there could never be a greater need to increase the funding of the National Endowment for the Arts and for that resource to go to state and local governments so that we can use the incredible benefit of arts and well-being. Will you join me in advancing this budget? And as we're trying to rebuild our economy after losing 10 million jobs, the fuel that arts and culture and creativity provide, not only for innovation in every workforce, but also for the 9-to-1 leverage that comes from every public dollar invested, we must include increased arts and culture funding as a part of our economic recovery package. So with that, I'd like to move us to having some discussion. What about this frame is resonating for you? What raises questions and makes you pause? Do you have some examples of stories or data points that we should be tracking that could help make this case and should perhaps be included in the message guide to inspire others? And any other feedback you want to provide. The message framework is on slides 20 through 26 in the deck that was in the link. And with that, I turn it over to all of you to spark our conversation.
Thank you, Eric. And again, for participants, you can type questions into the chat, questions and comments. You can also raise your hand under participants and share your ideas verbally.
We have a couple questions off the bat. One is just about the 9-to-1 figure, but that's an average. Margaret Mary Lane says that in West Virginia it's much higher, much higher portion than that. My understanding is that is, pre-existing research and that is a national average? Someone confirm that?
Yeah, this is Pam. I would say so, and I would also comment. I would also comment that if I were going to use this strategy in West Virginia, where those calculations are different, absolutely use the calculations that that work for that state-specific advocacy in West Virginia. And I saw a message on the chat that the 9-to-1 is specific to arts endowment grant making. So at the federal level.
Yeah. Another question we have here is about equity, particularly racial equity and social justice, and sort of how that fits into this broader message framework and where it might live here.
Rob, is it okay if I jump in on that one, or do you want to jump in? Great. So first of all, thank you. I love that question, and it fits in so many places. In the fundamental overarching narrative, strengthen our nation. If you're working on racial equity, if you're working on social justice, what you hear over and over, if you read Sam from the beginning, et cetera, this is work that's about strengthening our nation. It's about making our communities stronger. It's about making sure that everybody has the opportunity to innovate. That's the work of addressing social injustice. That's the work of advancing racial equity. So one is, of course, you're going to look at who's the lawmaker you're talking to. Is that the right way to come into the conversation? But it fits into the overarching frame about strengthening the nation. It then fits into every single one of the benefits frames. If we're talking about the benefit for economy, arts and culture and arts and creativity is a powerful vehicle to advance voice and a powerful vehicle to advance economic equity in terms of whose innovations are coming to the fore. If we're talking about education, really moving education to create space where every person has the ability to show up as their full selves and to be able to express their full selves and to be able to thrive in ways that are more diverse than one way of approaching education. The idea of creativity and the idea of the ingredient that arts and creativity adds to education is fundamentally aligned with that. So really, in every aspect of the message frame, the story you tell can be a social justice story or can be a racial equity story, just as the story you tell in every benefit could be an economic development story, could be a private sector innovation story, which is why we're really recommending that we did not learn that things fit neatly on party lines, but they fit based upon the policymaker you're talking to and understanding what are the issues that policymaker cares the most about, and making the story of how we talk about these benefits align with them can be so powerful.
And George, the other thing that your question makes me think about is also, how are you shaping the call to action in a way that ensures that the policies that result are designed to benefit first those impacted most, right? So if it's in the context of COVID, are we looking at economic recovery resources that are really focused on the communities hardest hit by COVID? So there might be social justice elements of the storytelling piece, but also I know that you all are going to be thinking about that in the context of the call to action too.
Quick note on the question of would CEOs as spokespeople be helpful? So absolutely, and one great quote from a policymaker was, you know what? When I go talk to CEOs, I've talked to the CEO of Boeing, I've talked to other aerospace CEOs, and when I talk to them, not one of them tells me I'm really, really worried about people getting back to basics. I'm worried about the 3 R's. I'm wondering where I'm going to find that workforce. What they say to me is, I need creative people. I need people that can solve problems. I need people that can innovate. That's my biggest worry as a CEO. And this policymaker says, and I use those quotes when I'm talking to my colleagues and say, this is about innovation. So absolutely, any of you that have connections to CEOs from any industry where you think we can get a quote, please send that connect to the folks at NASAA and it will be used.
Another question that we had here is the notion of arts and arts education as a right, sort of using a rights frame, particularly in civil rights, and whether that's something that we've entertained in the process here of development.
Yeah, so the formative research very much ruled out consideration of that frame. It is not something that we found in any of the literature scan, in any of the value scans. When we did the political discourse analysis, where we looked at what do policymakers who've supported arts funding and what do policymakers who've opposed arts funding, how do they frame it? The rights frame did not come up in any of the supporter arguments. The other piece is very, very significant research we've done in other fields has said that the rights frame is a really challenging frame. It immediately sparks worries about takings and worries about things being unfair, particularly for folks who are centrists and conservatives. And that's true in urban and rural communities. So we did not include a rights frame in the proposed messaging that we tested because of what we'd seen in the formative research.
Sure. We have Claire Rice has raised her hand in the participant section.
Thank you. Just a quick question. We were, a couple of years ago, we were engaged in a very interesting body of research NASA had commissioned around GOP, the GOP specifically, and just wonder, and some of those motivations for changing behavior or changing attitudes around support of public funding for the arts are a little bit different in terms of priorities, like military was very high near the top, et cetera. So the framing is slightly different. I'm just sort of wondering how these two bodies of work correspond or don't.
So we used the information from that body of work, and we, as Rob said, we tested a much longer list of potential benefits. So for example, national security, military readiness, defense, et cetera, was tested, and it did not test well. That what we found is, despite what came up in the polling when talking with policymakers, with their staff, et cetera, there was a very small set of them that said, yeah, I think that's probably helpful, but it doesn't feel like that feels like a real stretch. And there were many who said, wow, that feels like a stretch. I would never say that. That argument wouldn't work for me. So I think the reconciling piece is the distinction between actually testing messaging in the milieu of a conversation around the asking for funding and how people reacted to it, and comparing it to other potential benefits. And as you can see, there are benefits that came out of that research that did test really well and reconciled. So the findings from that research were built into the much longer set of options we tested, and some of them really resonated and some of them less so.
Great, thank you so much.
Eric, could you speak to the specific issue of the military and the health and wellness benefit?
Rob, go ahead.
Yeah, that's a good point. So, and we've actually had another question to come in the chat on the theme of, was there any constructive criticism? And I think I can tackle both of those in one. So we did test the impact of arts therapy, for example, on helping any wide variety of individuals deal with and overcome trauma, including veterans. And that message tested extraordinarily well. It's worth noting that we did have one interviewee who spoke very candidly in a way that I think it can also be instructive and illuminating, which is that there are many fields that position why you need to fund their field sort of on the backs of the service of our active military and our veterans. And sometimes, especially because there are members of the military who are in Congress and who are staffers and who are staffing committees, who hear that messaging and feel as though the outsized scale of the messaging isn't matched by an outsized investment in the actual activities that accomplish that. And so a piece of sort of the constructive criticism for the field is, yes, the argument resonates, and many people check that off as being a really motivating benefit, and that's when we say health and well-being tested well, what we're often saying is that the idea of supporting veterans is really what tested really well in that particular bucket. And at the same time, we just need to be really thoughtful as a field about not only how are we carrying that into our conversations, but how are we carrying that into our programming and our activities to make sure that we're really making true on our commitments and really adding the kinds of proof points that will make that messaging really valid.
Great. We have a question from Carl about messaging around the creative sector as small businesses themselves, as local small businesses, which I'm sure there's plenty to say. Does one of you want to jump onto that?
So the answer is an emphatic yes. So in the economic benefits discussion, that is very much a part of the benefit, this idea that every field benefits from creativity, that one of the sparks that creates small business is creativity in any field. And then certainly you could carry that further to specific creative-driven businesses that define themselves more in the creative space. It's also a part of the strengthen the nation, strengthen communities message. And finally, of course, it's a part of the why is it important for this investment to have public funding so creativity and arts are fostered in every community, including small towns and rural communities, where these small businesses need to be able to exist, not just if you happen to be in the Bay Area or in the Research Triangle where there's adequate access to venture funding. So an emphatic yes, there can be messaging around that. We did not hear as the leading message that you should talk about economic development as being what arts and culture do is they support small business. It was that all business benefits from arts and culture, and depending on who you're talking to and what their interest is, you can make an amazing case for small business. You can make an amazing case for Fortune 100 companies as well.
Two questions just come in related to beauty, so I'm going to sort of package them together. One is that the idea of beauty can be a bit subjective or abstract and could even come across as elitist and sort of not as tangible. So the question is, have we considered other words, other terms as a frame for that notion of beauty, perhaps like access? And we might need to get a little clarification on exactly where that is going. And then the other question related to beauty is that people like arts and choose them as a way to a meaningful life. How does this come across, sort of a sense of meaning in relation to beauty?
Thank you. So two great questions. So the framing that we're recommending is about bringing grace and beauty into our lives and giving us opportunity to share our creative gifts and to experience the creativity of others. Like all of the benefits messages, our recommendation is going to be to have, and the guide will have sub messages that are different ways of expressing that can appeal to different folks. But what we tested and what we saw in the discourse analysis of policymakers was, particularly among more conservative and religious folks, the idea of grace was very important. Among many folks, the idea of beauty was really important. So again, what we're talking about here, and it's important to note, we didn't say this at the beginning and we should, this framing in this narrative is really about policymakers and public funding for arts and culture. And so if you were asking us, is this the messaging we should be using with the general public to do audience development and better community engagement and stakeholder engagement, we'd say actually no. If you look at the Creating Connection research, it's saying don't lead with economy. That isn't motivating for people to buy tickets and to want to support the arts organization, including to advocate for arts funding as a citizen. So we really need to look at the context for that, and different language works in different places. What we found in our testing around the concept of meaning is that it is a trigger that's a negative trigger for a fair number of policymakers around the sense of self-indulgence, around this sense of, hey, that's not the public's job to help you find meaning, and also does that cross over into who's defining meaning, et cetera, et cetera. I would say there are individual policymakers where if you see that in their language, if you see that as why they're talking about they care about arts and culture, you absolutely can carry that forward. So we know from research with the public that creating meaning is a very important aspect of the value that arts and creativity and arts and creative expression bring to people. And that is very present in other message frameworks that are aimed at the public to engage in creative activity. It is not something we found to be motivating for policymakers in the framework of public funding. And that's a final thing I'll say there is many of the people we talked to had a much broader view of why they care about arts and creativity, but it was in the, I love arts and creativity is very important and matters to me, but that's not stuff we should be funding with taxpayer money. So the getting it to the, this is what we should be funding with taxpayer money, it's the same arts and creativity. It's the same, let's fund this broad array of activities, but it's for a set of reasons that resonate and either provide them with excuse and cover, or really are resonating with what they care about as a lawmaker, which doesn't take away at all the incredible power and need to have messaging when we're talking to people in community about engaging with our field, about the meaning making that happens. Just like you'll notice, we have not used the word arts and culture. And we found in our testing that arts and culture was less motivating and created issues and concerns around public funding. But we know that in many communities, people care a lot about culture and cultural heritage, and that language works really well when we're looking at other stakeholders.
Thank you, Eric. We have one, go ahead, Rob.
Just one point to make as it relates to these benefits messages, that we have education, we have communities, we have beauty as handles, but it's really the package of ideas that are after the handle that we're talking about. So, and where you're talking about the idea of beauty, it's the full context of arts and creativity inspire us and bring grace and beauty into our lives is what we were really testing. And that handle that we're using for that paragraph isn't, that's not your message. So I just want to make sure that there's clarity in terms of if beauty isn't right for you, or isn't right for the policymaker or the influencer that you're engaging, that's fine. But we encourage you to look at the bolded sentence and really think about what elements here may or may not work for that particular policymaker. I also, since we only have about 5 minutes left of the conversation, welcome continued questions. But we also want to create some space, since our job right now is really to very actively work on crafting this narrative guide. If there are specific examples from your lives and from your advocacy that can help us illuminate this and bring this to life in a way that's going to be really impactful for you, we also welcome you to either raise your hand in the participant section or share that in the chat too.
And Rob, you sparked something for me. Could you or Eric speak to the need for customization and prioritization with respect to what our field can expect in the narrative guide, just at least big picture?
So I'm happy to take that, Eric, unless you want to lead the way.
Go ahead.
So yeah, so in the narrative guide, what we were testing were these really high level ideas, right? And those are the strategy for your conversations. What is going to make that conversation really impactful is when you are framing it in the context of the particular district, in the context of the particular community that you represent and that your lawmaker is working to advocate for. So just using the health and well-being bullet as an example, right? Like when you walk in the door, you have some strategy here in terms of how you frame a conversation around the benefits of health and well-being. But you're not just going to frame it in this sort of like general abstract way. You're going to talk about in Lincoln City, the hospital has been integrating arts therapies, and they have found that they have been able to reduce the cost of healthcare by X amount. That's of course matched by research that has been done by the military's VA. So you'll use both data and proof points as well as local examples and stories in order to make the ideas in this strategy real. And our task is to develop a narrative guide that gives you some guidance on how to accomplish that. So we will be packaging up this high-level strategy for you. And then, as Eric mentioned, especially in the benefit sections, we'll be giving you some sample proof points and data points, as well as a sample story or two, just to give you some flavor. It'll be particular to a district that may or may not be your own, but will give you the sense of the kind of homework that you can then do to find the right example from your communities.
The other thing I'd like to add there, which I know a lot of the people on this call, so most of you don't need to hear this from us, and you don't need it in a guide because you do this every day. But I don't think we had a single interview where they said, hey, you haven't asked me about this. But what's really important is for people to do their homework about who is the lawmaker they're talking to, and what do they care about, and what have they supported, and what's their perspective in the community, and which, for some of my colleagues, you got to hit this education message, and for others, don't even go there. Instead, really focus here. And so you all know that. We will, in the guide, put links to some of the kind of really good arts advocacy resources around how to prep for an advocacy meeting, et cetera. But as Rob's saying, it's both about picking the stories that are relevant to your community. It's also about really looking at the strategy for that policymaker and what components of those benefits should we lead with, which of them should we pick, which of them should we not pick, and what's the example that we would choose to use and give that will be relevant to that lawmaker.
I see a question from Hawaii Arts Alliance. I'm sorry I don't see your name on the chat, but the question is, what perspectives did our research sample include specific to policymakers? So I can very sort of live for the purposes of this group, just give you a general sense. Again, that sample was, we oversampled in terms of conservative perspectives, and one of whom was a mayor on the conservative side of the spectrum. The policymakers represented, and some of these are going to be congressional, some of these will be House and some will be Senate, but the states involve New Mexico, Nevada, New York, Oklahoma, Minnesota, California, Maine, Arkansas, Mississippi, and Pennsylvania. So that just gives you a general sense.
I think we hit Alaska too.
Yeah, and Oregon.
And, oh yeah, and Oregon.
Yeah, and more.
Well, yeah, that's a good point. So what I was sharing, were the elected officials, and there were also arts advocates from a really specific set of perspectives that we were trying to ensure that we were getting built into our sample as well. So that's just gives you some flavor, but not all of it. I'm glad to see people reflecting on the benefit statements, and it sounds like broadly these resonate. Since we are going to be wrapping here in a moment, if anybody has any just sort of closing words of advice for Metropolitan Group as we go forth and craft this narrative guide, or closing comments that you'd like to share in the chat, please go ahead and do so now. And thank you all so much for your time.